Before Rome owned Britain, before stone roads cut through the countryside, before forts, tax records, bathhouses, and Latin names settled over the land like a second weather, there was a moment when the invasion could still fail. Not at sea, not on the beaches, not in some glorious clash of banners and speeches. It could have failed at a river, and not because the river was impossible to cross. Rivers are crossed all the time in war. Men build bridges, men find shallows, men lash together boats, and trust the current less than they trust the enemy. No, what made the Medway dangerous in 43 AD was not simply water. It was timing, it was pressure, it was the shape of a coalition, forced to stand still and hold one line long enough against the best military machine in the Western world. That is the part people tend to miss. The Battle of the Medway is usually remembered as a Roman success story, a demonstration of discipline, planning, and specialized troops used with perfect precision. And that is true, but there is another way to understand what happened there, and in some ways it is the more human one. The Medway was the place where the tribes of southern Britain discovered that holding good ground is not the same thing as holding a battle together, because sometimes a defensive line does not collapse when men run. Sometimes it collapses when everyone is still there, still armed, still furious, but no longer reacting to the same danger. To understand why that river mattered, you have to go back to the kind of invasion this was. Claudius had been emperor for barely 2 years. He was not the figure Rome had imagined leading conquests. He was not Julius Caesar, not a dazzling field commander with a legend already built around him. He came to power through shock and violence after Caligula's assassination, lifted into office by the Praetorian Guard in a moment that felt less like destiny than accident. The Senate did not know what to make of him. A scholar, an awkward man, a body marked by weakness, a ruler who did not look like the sort of man armies sing about. That kind of ruler needs results, not later, soon. There are few remedies in imperial politics more powerful than a successful war. A new province can become a public argument. A victory can answer questions that speeches never will. Britain offered Claudius exactly what he needed: distance, prestige, unfinished business, and symbolism. Julius Caesar had crossed to Britain twice, but he had not transformed the island into a Roman possession. That left a gap in Rome's story, and gaps like that pull ambitious rulers toward them. So Claudius approved the invasion, and command went to Aulus Plautius. That choice matters. If this had been a campaign meant only for spectacle, Rome could have chosen a louder man, someone grander, someone whose name arrived before him. But Plautius was not chosen to make poetry. He was chosen to make success. Methodical, disciplined, reliable. The kind of commander who does not fall in love with momentum for its own sake. The kind who understands that an invasion is not one battle, but a chain of problems that must be solved in the correct order. He took 4 legions across the Channel, supported by auxiliaries, and the force was enormous by the standards of the time, roughly 40,000 men. Even before the first ramp touched British shore, everyone involved knew the campaign would be judged against Caesar's earlier failures. Rome was not just invading a land, it was correcting a memory. The Britons were not blind to this. They knew Rome was coming. The tribes were not stupid, and they were not passive. They had time to prepare, and the resistance in the southeast was led by 2 brothers, Caratacus and Togodumnus, sons of Cunobeline's line, men with both status and urgency. They understood something fundamental about the situation. If Rome established itself cleanly and began moving inland in good order, the campaign would become much harder to stop. So they prepared to contest the invasion. But preparation is not the same thing as certainty. A coalition can gather around a shared enemy and still be full of fractures. Different tribes had different leaders, different habits of war, different levels of commitment, different calculations about what they could afford to lose. Some wanted total resistance, some wanted time. Some wanted to see who would win before they gave everything. This is the first hidden weakness in the story. Rome came as a single war machine. Britain met it as a shared fear. Those are not the same thing. The Britons expected the landing at the narrowest, most obvious crossing from Gaul. That made sense. It was where common logic pointed. But common logic is exactly what good commanders exploit. Claudius did not land where he was most expected. He landed on the eastern Kentish coast, likely around Richborough. And because the British concentration was arranged with a different landing in mind, Rome came ashore without the kind of catastrophic resistance that can maul an army before it even forms properly. That alone changed the rhythm of the campaign. An invasion that lands under heavy fire begins tired, disordered, and psychologically bruised. One that lands clean begins with initiative. Rome did not arrive in Britain gasping. It arrived with structure intact. From there, the Romans moved inland, and in early encounters near river lines south of the Medway, they pushed the Britons back. Not annihilated them, not shattered them, but pushed them, enough to force decisions, enough to make Caratacus and Togodumnus think less about how to destroy the invader and more about where to stop him. They chose the Medway. On paper, it was a sound decision. In practice, it may have been the last good decision available to them. The Medway was no trivial obstacle, a broad, tidal river, awkward, dangerous, hard to cross in armor, and harder still under attack. A river like that does not have to be uncrossable. It only has to be uncrossable long enough for morale to shift, long enough for supply lines to stretch, long enough for disease, doubt, weather, and impatience to begin doing the defender's work. If Rome stalled at the Medway, the campaign changed. Suddenly, Claudius had not launched a triumphant conquest, but a difficult and expensive gamble. Suddenly, southern Britain looked less like a prize and more like a trap. Suddenly, the tribes would have proof that resistance worked. So the Britons fell back across the far bank and prepared to make the river their answer. And here we reach the emotional center of the battle, because a defensive line is not only made of shields and spears, it is made of belief. Belief that the men to your left will hold. Belief that the men to your right will answer the same threat you answer. Belief that your commanders are seeing the same battlefield you see. Belief that the obstacle in front of you will shape the enemy the way you think it will. For the Britons, the Medway promised all of that. The river would simplify the fight. It would force Rome into a narrow problem. It would give a tribal coalition the kind of clean defensive logic that coalitions desperately need. Hold the far bank. Punish any crossing. Use chariots and mobility where the ground allows. Strike the enemy when he is half committed, half formed, half safe. If the battle stayed that simple, Britain had a chance. But Rome rarely agreed to simple battles, unless simple favored Rome. There is a temptation, when telling this story, to make the Roman solution sound obvious in hindsight. It was not. A defended river crossing is one of the oldest nightmares in warfare. A commander who misjudges it can burn men into the current and lose a campaign in an afternoon. You can see why the Britons trusted the Medway. It was not delusion. It was good military sense. What they could not know was that Plautius was not trying to beat the river first. He was trying to break the sequence by which the defenders would respond to the crossing. That is a different kind of thinking. The Roman army had auxiliaries from many peoples across the empire, and among them were Batavians, men from the Rhine Delta with an unusual and extremely valuable reputation. They could swim rivers in full gear, and in some traditions even with their horses. Whether every later description of that skill was perfectly true in every detail is less important than the operational fact that Rome trusted them to do what normal troops would struggle to do. Plautius used them not as a dramatic flourish, but as a wedge. That distinction matters. He did not need them to win the battle alone. He needed them to force the Britons to look backward while the real crossing developed. He needed confusion at exactly the point where defensive unity mattered most. Because what made British warfare dangerous was not only courage, it was mobility, shock. The ability of chariots to move, harass, threaten flanks, create noise, create dust, create the sense that the battlefield was wider than the enemy could comfortably manage. Chariots are often romanticized or dismissed, depending on who is telling the story, but within their own tactical environment they mattered. They gave speed to men fighting on familiar ground. They gave commanders options. They made static defenders feel alive. So the Roman move was not merely to cross. It was to go after the thing that let the British line remain fluid once the crossing began. The Batavians were sent across with a purpose that was almost surgical. Not to stand in the middle of the river and die beautifully. Not to challenge the strongest point of the line head-on, but to strike into the rear and create disruption, particularly among the horses that powered British chariot warfare. Kill them, scatter them, loose them into panic, and something subtle but devastating begins to happen to the defenders. Not all panic looks like screaming men running. Sometimes panic looks like officers turning their heads at the wrong moment. Sometimes it looks like messengers arriving too late. Sometimes it looks like one part of the line holding position, while another part starts dealing with a new emergency nobody expected to matter yet. The British line at the Medway was strong, as long as the battle arrived in the order they expected. Rome changed the order. Imagine the riverbank that day, not as a clear, heroic tableau, but as overlapping zones of attention. Men on the front looking at the water, chariot crews preparing to exploit any half-formed Roman advance, commanders trying to read the enemy through distance, mud, noise, and incomplete information. Then, suddenly, alarm from the rear, horses cut loose, animals shrieking, bolting, crashing into handlers and gear, dust where there should not be dust, shouts where there should have been control. The line does not vanish, but it loses its single mind. That was enough. While attention fractured, Roman forces under officers, including the future Emperor Vespasian and his brother Sabinus, found ways to force the crossing, likely at a ford. Once formed troops begin getting over in strength, the defender's problem changes instantly. Before, the goal is to prevent a bridgehead. Afterward, the goal is to erase one. Those are not the same battle, and the second is often harder, because now the enemy is not drowning in a river. He is planting feet on your side of it. Day one did not end in some effortless Roman triumph. That matters. The Britons fought hard. The battle lasted 2 days, and any 2-day battle in this context tells you resistance was serious. Togodumnus is traditionally associated with death around this stage of the campaign, though the exact circumstances are not perfectly clear in the record. But even uncertainty can have a psychological effect. In coalition warfare, rumor can wound almost as deeply as certainty. If a leading figure is dead, or dying, or missing, men begin adjusting to consequences before commands confirm them. And Caratacus, for all the later Roman narratives that frame the battle around eventual imperial success, was no decorative opponent. He survived. He adapted. He would continue resisting Rome for years. That alone tells you the British resistance was not crushed by one clever trick. It was damaged at a crucial moment, in a crucial place. By the end of the first day, Rome had what it needed most: a position across the river and the ability to continue feeding strength into it. That is the true hinge. Once the crossing existed as a fact rather than a possibility, the Medway stopped being a shield and became terrain behind which the defenders could be driven. Day 2 was where the deeper weakness of the British position revealed itself, because coalitions are often strongest at the moment of refusal and weakest at the moment of adjustment. To decide together that the invader must be stopped is one kind of unity. To absorb losses, reassign roles, compensate for missing mobility, respond to partial breakthroughs, and still act with one rhythm under relentless professional pressure, that is another kind entirely. Rome was built for the second kind. The legions did not need inspiration every minute. They needed commands, intervals, standards, practiced habits. They were not fighting as separate tribal identities temporarily aligned against danger. They were fighting as components of one machine whose whole design assumed that battles change shape and must be managed through the change. The Britons, by contrast, had been forced into the kind of battle least favorable to a looser alliance. Their horses had been hit. Their mobility had been compromised. Their line had already absorbed a day of pressure. And now the Romans were not retreating back into the river. They were coming forward. This is where the emotional texture shifts. At the beginning of the battle, the Britons had the kind of fear that energizes. Rome is here. Hold the bank. Stop the crossing. Everything is simple because everything depends on one immediate success. By the second day, the fear is different. Now the question becomes, if the river did not stop them, what will? That is a far worse question. It crawls along a line. It settles in the gut. It gets louder each time a Roman formation appears, where no Roman formation should have been if the plan had worked. It grows when you realize the men beside you are still brave, still armed, still striking back, and yet the shape of the day continues moving against you. This is how a battle begins to feel fated before it is technically lost. Vespasian, by later accounts, pressed hard. The Romans tightened their bridgehead, stabilized their formations, and drove forward without giving the defenders the time or space needed to turn the crossing back into chaos. Every minute that passed favored organization over improvisation. Every renewed Roman push forced the Britons to solve three problems at once: where to hold, where to counter, and how to protect against the next unexpected movement. And somewhere inside that pressure, the line began to break. Not necessarily everywhere at once. Battles rarely end as neatly as maps suggest. One section bends, another still fights. One commander pulls men back in order, another refuses and loses too many. Someone thinks reinforcement is coming and holds too long. Someone else sees dust and assumes the flank is gone. Signals fail. Sound lies. The bravery remains, but coherence thins. That is often the final stage before collapse, not cowardice, but fragmentation. Caratacus escaped westward. That too matters. His survival means the battle did not erase British resistance in some absolute sense, but it did destroy the best immediate chance to stop Rome's penetration into the south. Once the Medway was lost, the campaign stopped being a contest over whether the invasion could be checked near the coast, and became a deeper struggle over how much of Britain could remain unconquered and for how long. And now, at the moment when many commanders would have chased total glory, the Roman story takes another turn. Plautius stopped. This is one of the most revealing decisions in the entire campaign, and in some ways it tells you more about Rome than the crossing itself. The route onward towards Camulodunum, the powerful center associated with the Catuvelauni, was opening. Momentum was real. The enemy had been forced back, another kind of commander hungrier for personal fame, or simply drunk on the logic of pursuit might have pressed forward, trying to complete the campaign in his own name. Plautius did not. He sent word to Claudius and waited. That decision has sometimes been treated as simple obedience, but it is more than that. It shows a commander who understood the campaign as political theater as well as military action. The conquest of Britain was not only about defeating tribes, it was about manufacturing legitimacy. Claudius needed to appear, to receive submission, to stand close enough to victory that Rome could picture him as the author of it. Plautius could have stolen that climax by continuing too quickly. Instead, he preserved it. This is where the Roman system reveals one of its most formidable qualities. When functioning well, it could align battlefield success with imperial narrative. Claudius arrived in Britain later, stayed only a short time, and accepted submissions with all the symbolism such a moment required. He brought elephants, almost certainly more useful as spectacle than battlefield necessity at that stage. Then, he returned to Rome to celebrate a triumph. He received the title Britannicus. The image was complete. The emperor had conquered Britain. But empires are often remembered through the faces of the men who arrive at the end, not the hands of the men who solve the hardest problems first. At the Medway, the hardest problem was not simply water. It was sequence. It was attention. It was whether a coalition of proud, capable local powers could remain unified under a kind of pressure designed specifically to force disunity. That is why this battle deserves to be understood differently. The usual moral is that Rome was disciplined and the Britons were not. That is too simple, and it flattens the human reality. The Britons were not fools charging into a machine they did not understand. They chose strong ground. They resisted fiercely. They adapted as best they could under immense pressure. Their leaders were serious opponents, not theatrical props for Roman greatness. But they were fighting as an alliance whose strengths depended on motion, confidence, and responsiveness in a battle that slowly denied all three. Rome did not merely overpower them. Rome made them defend in fragments. And once that happened, the battle was no longer about whether the Medway could be held as a line on a map. It became about whether enough of the people behind that line were still living inside the same battle. That is a much harder thing to preserve. Think of a warrior on the British side that day, some man whose name no chronicle kept. Maybe he had spent the night before the fighting believing the river would do what rivers do in war, buy time, force mistakes, narrow choices. Maybe he had heard the reassurance passed down the bank that Rome would have to come at them the hard way, and that when it did, they would break it in the water. Maybe he had looked at the breadth of the Medway and felt, for a moment, relief. Then, the next day does not arrive as expected. Instead of a clean front, the battle gets behind him. Instead of a trapped enemy, there is sudden danger where there should have been order. Horses are screaming. Chariots are compromised. Men who should be watching the river are looking back. Then Romans are over. Not many at first, not enough to end everything, but enough to make the whole meaning of the place change. A river that was supposed to separate now connects. A line that was supposed to simplify now multiplies problems. Courage does not vanish in such moments. It simply becomes insufficient by itself. That may be the real sadness of the Medway for the Britons. Not that they lacked bravery, not that they chose foolish ground, but that they were forced to discover, in real time, that the enemy in front of them was not trying to win the kind of battle they had prepared to fight. And that is often how invasions truly succeed. Not by smashing every strong point head-on, not by proving moral superiority through blood alone, but by finding the one place where the defender's confidence depends on events arriving in the expected order, and then disrupting that order until confidence itself becomes another casualty. After the Medway, Roman Britain did not spring fully formed into existence. There would still be campaigns, rebellions, accommodations, betrayals, local bargains, imperial overreach, and centuries of uneven rule. The conquest was not one clean act. History almost never is. But the southern gateway had been forced open. The coalition that might have checked the invasion near the coast had failed to do so. The future had tilted, and once futures tilt under Rome, they often keep falling. That is why the battle matters. Not because it gave us the most famous speech or the bloodiest legend. Not because it produced a single cinematic image that swallows everything else, but because it shows, with unusual clarity, how empires turn local strength into local confusion, and how a people can still fight hard, still fight honorably, and still lose the shape of the battle that would have saved them. The Medway did not break first. The shared certainty behind the defense did. And when that broke, the river became only water.